Good afternoon, and welcome to the Quincy Institute's book talk on Thant Myint U's book, Peacemaker, U Thant and the Forgotten Quest for a Just World Order. My name is Trita Parsi. I am the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a transpartisan think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. In his new book, Peacemaker, U Thant and the Forgotten Quest for a Just World, historian and former UN official Thant Myint U tells the untold story of how U Thant, his grandfather, steered the world through the Cuban Missile Crisis, mediated conflicts from Congo to the Kashmir, challenged Washington on Vietnam, and championed decolonization and environmental stewardship decades ahead of his time. Drawing vivid portraits of Cold War flashpoints based on newly declassified archives, Myint U recast U Thant's legacy as a roadmap for principled multilateralism in an era of renewed great power rivalry. Given the shifting world order and the challenges the UN and multilateral institutions face, U Thant's experience, story, and most importantly, vision are actually more relevant today than ever before. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. And those who are watching it on YouTube or other platforms, you can leave it in the comment section. We will try to get to your questions as well. So with no further ado, please let me introduce Thant Myint U more properly. He's an award-winning writer, historian, and international public servant. He's the honorary fellow of Trinity College at Cambridge University and a senior fellow of the United Nations Foundation. He was born in New York City and was educated at Harvard, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and Cambridge University, where he completed his PhD in history in 1996. He was named by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the 100 leading global thinkers in 2013, and by Prospect magazine as one of the 50 world thinkers of 2014. Thant Myint U has served on 3 United Nations peacekeeping operations in Cambodia, in the Balkans, and as well as at the UN Secretariat in New York, including as the head of policy planning in the Department of Political Affairs in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. He is the author of 5 books, and we are pleased to have him here with us to discuss his latest book. Thank you so much and welcome. I think you're on mute.
Thanks very much, Trita.
I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book. This was a fantastic read. You have such a rich way of describing the history. Clearly, these recently declassified documents add a tremendous amount of details, much of it that I think was completely unknown before, particularly when it comes to the episode of the missile crisis that is really not only valuable in of its own historical sense, but also because of the wisdom and the lessons that we can learn from it today. One thing that I was left more questioning, more unclear about, though, is exactly why and how you chose to write this book. There is a bit of a distance almost between yourself and your grandfather in the way that you tell the story, I assume deliberate. You mentioned, for instance, that as you were working at the UN, you were passing by his portrait every day after grabbing coffee and getting to the elevators. Yet it was one of his co-workers that was more of a mentor and an inspiration for your own work. So how did it come about that you wrote this book in the first place?
Thanks very much, Trita. I mean, in a way, he was obviously someone who was always part of my life. He died when I was 8 years old, but I lived with him up until that point. And so I remember him quite vividly, but as a grandfather, as someone who was at home and watching TV and swimming with us in the swimming pool and things like that. And when I joined the UN more than, well, almost 20 years later, he was sort of already a forgotten character, even within the UN system. So those years I worked in the UN in the 1990s and 2000s, almost no one ever really mentioned him. I saw his portrait in the UN, but I never really reflected very much on his legacy. I read a few of the things that had been written about him. So I had a sense of the kind of broad outline of his life and his career, but that was it. And I wasn't intending to write this book. I was back in Cambridge after a long stint in Burma, working in Burma for about 10 years. And I came across the archive, which has been around. It's been progressively declassified over the years, but then digitized over the COVID period. And it included both the official archive, but also his personal papers. So when he died, my parents, who were living with him, moved to a much smaller house, and so gave everything that was in his study, everything from hotel receipts to private letters to birthday cards to medical records, to
Mm,
the UN. And those have been digitized. So I started looking at them and I started realizing that there was a story there that was very different from anything that I'd read about the 60s. So that was the
mm,
origin of my thinking
mm.
about it and finally writing this book.
But was it a story that you wanted to say because it was untold, or was it because you already then saw the relevance that it had for today and the crisis of the multilateral system today?
I didn't see because, back when I started the book in 2021, I think we weren't aware that we were in as much of a crisis as maybe we
Mm,
think we are in now. So that wasn't really my intent to kind of shine a particular light on problems today or a way forward
mm,
from the problems today. The mystery that I sort of was trying to grapple with was why this was missing from the historical record that I saw quite early on. Then I went to the library
mm,
and looked up, even very recently written secondary sources on everything from Cuba to Vietnam to the Middle East in the 60s, and saw in the archive, but not just in the archive. I went back to contemporary media, looked at the New York Times. A lot of the stuff was there in the media at the time, but then subsequently missing. And so that was the mystery for me. What really happened? Was it what I was seeing in the archive? Was it something else? Was I missing something? And
mm,
was there a story to tell? And only later, as I began working on the book itself and trying to craft the overall narrative, that I began to think about what it meant in terms of what happened
mm,
afterwards from the 60s
mm,
onwards to the present day.
mm. Yeah, and I want to get back to that because I think there's some really valuable lessons for today, particularly as we're now moving into a situation in which next year there will be elections for a new Secretary General. Um, I don't want to go into the missile crisis quite yet, but it is very fascinating that as that crisis begins and unfolds, he had been Secretary General for just a couple of months. And prior to that, he was a school teacher in Burma. Can you tell us a little bit more about his life before he enters the scene and how that impacted his perspective on these matters and how he reflected on that towards the end of his life? Because it is just an absolutely remarkable story of his humble beginnings to where he ended up.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of his beginnings, he was born in a small town, which is now a few hours west of Rangoon, Yangon in Myanmar, then Burma, which was then part of the British Empire, then part of British India, in the Irrawaddy Delta. But in those days, in the 19 teens, 20s, it was a whole day steamer ride away, so very remote. I've been there. In those days, it would have had no electricity, no running water.
Mm,
He was from a well-to-do family, but his part of the family became suddenly impoverished when his father died, and his mother raised him and his three brothers alone. And he had to give up his dreams of university, finishing university, going on to maybe the Indian civil service. And he just went for 2 years, came back to his hometown and was a school teacher and then a headmaster of a little wooden school in that town. But he was always thinking of the outside world. So he subscribed to every newspaper, magazine he could from London, from Calcutta. He was the first Burmese member of the Left Book Club in London. I mean, he was dreaming of the League of Nations, international politics from this little town, um, mastering English himself. And then at age 39, he decided on a midlife career change, went to Rangoon, joined government service, rose through the ranks, became an intimate of the prime minister, close advisor, traveled the world. And then by 1957, 9 years, I think, 8, 9 years after leaving that little town, found himself in the middle of Midtown Manhattan as Burma's permanent representative to the UN. And within a few years, he had kind of developed this reputation as the man who got along with everyone, north, south,
mm,
east, west. And so when his predecessor, Dag Hammarskjöld, was killed, he became an early sort of favorite to be his successor.
mm, mm. There's just a wonderful story in the beginning of the book that I think also reflects the profound respect that people had for him, despite the fact that, of course, that over the course of 10 years, You cannot be a mediator. You cannot get involved in trying to resolve conflicts without creating frictions with many actors, including the superpowers. But he has his thank you dinner, and there's a surprise guest that shows up, John Lennon. Well, please share that story with our viewers because
Yeah, I
it's really
actually
a
start the
fantastic
book
story.
with that scene at the Pierre Hotel, which some people watching may know in New York. It was actually a luncheon. It was on a rainy, cold day in December 1971. And it was his farewell luncheon. It was a sort of a tribute. And it was this amazing collection of people. So it was funded by everyone from Chase Manhattan Bank to the Amalgamated Laundry Workers of New York, which gives you a sense that the labor unions at that time also had this very sort of internationalist outlook. Jackie Kennedy, other friends of his, helped to organize. And it was some of the people you might expect, so hundreds of diplomats, UN officials, but also all these other people were involved, sent messages, or were there themselves, from Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian Kon-Tiki explorer, to Jacques Cousteau, the underwater explorer, to people like Arnold Toynbee, Buckminster Fuller. All these people committed themselves to being international global citizens, and they call themselves planetary citizens. And they called U Thant planetary citizen number one. And at the end of this luncheon, Pete Seeger was playing the guitar. This is part of the program. And John Lennon, who was there with Yoko Ono, asked to borrow the guitar. And from the top table with U Thant, sang Imagine for the first time in America. So it's a microcosm, or it's a portrait of a very different America, a very different New York, a very different time when internationalism of a kind was mainstream,
Mm.
and UN was very much representative of it in many ways.
Mhm. And it was the first time that anyone in the United States had ever heard the song Imagine, that in so many different ways also reflected the perspective that U Thant had on the world and on the role that he should play as a Secretary General. More problematic elements, though, of course, or not problematic, but nevertheless tough episodes that he experienced. And one of the most important ones that are in the category of untold stories is the role that he played in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which he did get credit for. But for some reason, it's been, as you pointed out, airbrushed out of history, because there were thank you notes from both the Russians and the Americans to the role that he played. But I think the most critical thing in the beginning of it is he had not been given a mandate to play a role in this conflict, but he decided to try to interject himself into it. Why was that? Given all of the other things that already was on his plate, why did he make that decision, and how did it come about that at the end of the day he was given a mandate, and one that was ultimately crucial?
I think he understood, as perhaps other people did, that night, Sunday, October 22nd, when President Kennedy went on TV and told the American people in the world about the crisis and the setting up of the American blockade of Cuba. And everyone knew that there was a real possibility, with Soviet ships heading towards that blockade line, that we were within hours, days of a nuclear confrontation. And I think for U Thant, I mean, mandate or no mandate, he knew that he had to try to do something. And I think, his special sort of skill, maybe not skill, but sort of resource that he had, was that he came into office on the back of this wave of enthusiasm and embracing of the UN by all these newly decolonized countries, especially in Asia and Africa. And so he went to them first. And so for 24 hours, he consulted very closely with the leadership of many countries in Asia and Africa and with all of their ambassadors in New York. And he decided then on a plan, on a strategy. And I think he understood very early on that this wasn't really a military crisis, it was a political crisis.
Mhm.
And he had a sense, having met President Kennedy a few times by then, having spent a day with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, just weeks before in Russia on the Black Sea, that it was a political crisis and that his role was to craft the intervention that would allow both men to take a step back from the brink and allow space and time for diplomacy. And so he wrote a message to both, almost identical, essentially asking for a breathing space, asking both to suspend what they had done, Kennedy establishing the blockade, Khrushchev sending offensive weapons to Cuba for 2 weeks. And then that began a series of interactions between the three men in which U Thant emerged as very quickly as a mediator, sometimes secret, sometimes public, that did de-escalate the crisis over that really crucial week in 1962.
And how did the superpowers at the time, before U Thant has essentially interjected himself into this, how did they view the role of the Secretary General? Because I think there is a perception, perhaps partly as a result of the role that he started to play. Unfortunately, not a perception that exists any longer, but there was a period in which there was a perception that the Secretary General is the natural address for any type of a mediation. But that doesn't seem to have been the case at the time. So what was the perspective of the Americans and the Russians of what the role that the Secretary General should play, if any at all?
I mean, the prestige of the office was in many ways much higher than it is now. And his immediate predecessor, Dag Hammarskjöld, was responsible for a lot of that because he had been very active. He had been very successful in a number of conflicts in the late 1950s. But I think Kennedy and his team at the White House didn't really expect U Thant to play a role in solving for them the Cuban Missile Crisis. In those first days before Kennedy went on TV, they thought that the UN might be useful as a public relations platform, a Security Council place where they would make statements, make the Russians look bad, take tough positions, and then the real diplomacy would somehow happen elsewhere. But everyone was kind of thinking about this as things went along and unfolded. And when U Thant made his first intervention, sending these messages to Khrushchev and Kennedy, the initial reaction from the White House was quite negative. They didn't think that it was going to be useful. And it was actually President Kennedy that night who had a sort of light bulb moment. And quickly they woke up U Thant in the middle of the night and asked him to send a second message in his name, in U Thant's name, to Khrushchev, realizing that having a neutral UN Secretary General pass messages, insert himself, be a neutral point of reference was going to be useful if we were all going to get out of this crisis alive over those coming days.
And in the process of that mediation, plenty of messages going back and forth, headaches, of course, with Fidel Castro as well, who had obviously not an interest in having a clash, but had his own interest of making sure that Cuba was not thrown under the bus in a negotiation between the two parties. It is actually U Thant that comes up with the formula that ends up resolving the conflict of making sure that there's a mutual withdrawal from two different sides. A withdrawal that on the American side was actually not even publicly discussed for more than a decade. Tell us how that came about and how did that idea come to him?
I think a lot of that happened in his consultations with the Afro-Asians, as they call themselves, and representatives and leaders in the non-aligned movement. That the fair proposition, the intervention or the idea for a settlement could be around this trade of Soviet missiles in Cuba, which we now know were already armed with nuclear warheads, for an American pledge not to invade the island. That it wasn't simply a matter of the Soviets putting missiles in Cuba. It had to be set within this broader context of the Americans trying to oust Castro's revolutionary regime in Havana, and that had to be taken into consideration as well. So he crafted that, or he came up with that quite early on, and said that at the Security Council 2 days, 48 hours after President Kennedy's speech. He was the first to say that. And again, I think, he deserves some of the credit, but I think part of the credit goes to that wider coalition of countries that were keen from the start to try to avoid a nuclear holocaust.
And in some ways, that was his base of power, particularly in the early years, that he actually had what today we might have called the global South, the support of that coalition that gave him essentially a mandate to be able to step in. In that process, though, there was also, of course, the withdrawal of missiles, Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Why is it that this story of the role that he played that is so crucial, and you have both sides giving credit to him publicly, yet it is forgotten? It is not seen as a part of something, despite the fact that it is the first time that the Secretary General actually mediates between the two superpowers.
I mean,
And avoids a terrible, terrible outcome.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, he goes down to Havana as well at the height of the crisis and placates Fidel Castro. And so he becomes, as well, for Castro, the only point of reference that Castro wants to use because Castro is fuming with Moscow for having done a deal sort of above his head. But I think I mean, the story for U Thant, in a way, I mean, the story that could be told or could have been told but wasn't, was that the UN was Roosevelt's project. It was the project of 1945, set at Yalta and everything else. But that these Afro-Asians came in the late 1950s, kind of made their way into this American project, made it their home, embraced its ideas. And one of the very first things they did, in addition to putting U Thant there as their agent, as the head of the UN in 1961, was diffuse and prevent a war in the global north. But that wasn't the framing. And the
Mm.
framing could have been that, the superpowers came close to all out conflict, but a Burmese ex-school teacher mediated and both sides found a way to compromise. I think for Washington, very quickly, within weeks, it was really important to spin the story as one where the Americans and President Kennedy stood tough and the Russians backed down, and that was necessary for domestic political reasons. And I think Uthant understood that, which is part of the reason he never tried to claim credit. And I think
Mm.
over the years, that story, for many obvious reasons, gained traction and was never really challenged.
You mentioned that President Kennedy realized the utility of a neutral mediator that could help in this very, very tricky situation. Um, do you think that in the absence of that, were there other alternatives? Were there other alternatives that perhaps would have had the credibility that he had, who would have had the backing of the Afro-Asian bloc, who would have been able to come up with some of these different ideas? And essentially, was his role decisive?
I think so in some ways. I mean, it's a couple of things. I mean, for Kennedy, it was both that neutral point of reference, vis-a-vis Moscow, but it was also something else, which is even more curious or interesting, which is that in listening to the audio tapes from XCOM, the emergency committee he had set up with his top advisors, he says on more than one occasion when they're pushing him to take aggressive action and make that decision to bomb, to go into Cuba, which we now know would have been disastrous. He says we have to wait for U Thant's diplomacy. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but words to
Yeah.
that effect. So with his own people as well, he was using U Thant to create time for him to try to make the right decisions and come out of this in the right way. I think to answer your question, yes. I mean, maybe it would have been possible for somebody else from a neutral state to emerge as a kind of arbiter, but it would have taken days, if not weeks. And I think this very special thing was that we already had this built-in office of UN Secretary General, and it was already imbued with certain characteristics and had this person with impeccable neutralist non-aligned credentials. And for Khrushchev and for his men in the Kremlin, it was much easier to respond positively to a message from a neutral UN Secretary General from a non-aligned country than it was to an ultimatum from an American president. And again, as we all know in the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, hours, even minutes were important in avoiding that nuclear showdown.
And I want to go deeper into what that means for us today, given the current circumstances. But if we could touch on it a little bit briefly here, because you made it a very important point. Time was of the essence. If any other country were to try to step up, it would have to start from scratch, would have to build up the credentials, would have to win the acceptance of both sides, the trust of both sides, in a moment in which time really was not available. But that is the situation we have today because now the Secretary General is not seen as the natural address for mediation. Instead, we're relying upon the availability, the political circumstances of a handful of states that have still managed to retain a degree of neutrality. And in a world in which the neutral spaces in the world are dramatically shrinking, and make sure that they are under the right type of political circumstances to step up, which then means the transaction cost is much, much higher. The time consumption is much, much higher. There isn't that natural address. You were there at the UN during a period in which we saw that the Council and the Secretary General's standing and role started to become less than what it had been. How do you think U Thant would view the current situation? What would he have done? And what do you attribute the reality that we are now in a very different Security Council, a very different Secretary General as the office of it compared to what it was back
I
then?
mean, I think it's one of the biggest I mean, we have so many problems, but from one perspective, it's one of the biggest problems that we have. I mean, collectively, generally, that we don't have this person who could help to diffuse a potential nuclear war. And to paraphrase, Conor Cruise O'Brien, the Irish historian, diplomat, scholar, back in the late 1960s, he said the UN Secretary General may not be necessary in solving many different wars. It could be solved by individual governments or regional organizations or someone else. But every now and then you have a conflict, and it could be a potential nuclear conflict where someone called the UN Secretary General is indispensable in solving that and de-escalating that conflict. And I think that's as true today as then, but it means refurbishing the prestige of that office so that that person is in place. I mean, Conor Cruise O'Brien thought that everything else the UN did should be around keeping that office in that pristine position to play that role. And that all the drama, all the debates in the General Assembly really are this kind of part of creating that setting for that prestige of that office to remain so that that person can play that role. I think today we have to kind of think back a little bit into history. So, I mean, just three quick points. One is that, I mean, the UN always had this internal contradiction, right? I mean, it was both a big power alliance. It was meant to be this enforcement mechanism in 45. It never became that because the big powers themselves divided during the Cold War. And it never really overcame that basic kind of problem in its architecture. And we see this now with vetoes by different big powers, the US, Soviet Union on different conflicts. I mean, not Soviet Union, sorry, Russia on different conflicts. But the second thing is that, in the 90s, when I was working in the UN, 90s and early 2000s, the UN took a very different turn as well. It ceased to be this kind of multilateral institution that was playing that kind of role in solving interstate conflicts. And it became much more a Western, Northern, rich country, donor dominated institution through funding and a lot of good faith as well. I think a lot of governments simply wanted to do the right thing, but trying to solve problems in the global South through
Mm,
peacekeeping interventions, through aid interventions. And that really changed the complexion of the UN in many
mm,
different ways. And I think that unintentionally, in a way, reduced the sense of the Secretary General as this person who comes in emergencies, in special cases, to help mediate interstate conflicts. That role has been kind of not degraded, but forgotten to some extent,
mm.
partly because we don't know this earlier history.
Wouldn't you say, though, that to some extent, perhaps it wasn't entirely undeliberate in the sense that the Secretary General has himself also kind of come to the conclusion that the maneuverability to play that role is much less, and as a result, opted to focus on climate instead and make that the priority rather than play that crucial role of managing great power relations. And by that, that has further fueled the loss of prestige of that office and the greater, longer runway to reclaim that position in the future.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think it will take a lot to kind of reset that office, but I don't think it's impossible. I mean, compared to many other things which seem, I mean, even more impossible, like Security Council reform, perhaps to
Mm,
some extent in terms of expanding the membership. I think that Thant and his Dag Hammarskjöld, his predecessors in the late 50s and 60s, they benefited from a few things. I mean, they benefited from this broad, non-aligned Afro-Asian third world coalition that had just come into the UN, but were really enthusiastic about the UN. They benefited from still the remnants of that early US extreme enthusiasm for the UN in 1945. So there was still an American political investment. So even when Washington was not happy with the UN, they still felt this was partly our creation, our project, and so we have to still try to help it. That was across the board, almost across the political spectrum. And third, a huge amount of public interest and support for the UN on both sides of the
mm,
Atlantic. So he benefited from that, and we don't really have any of those elements. And we also don't have the active role of countries like Sweden, for example, of this kind of robust neutrality that was respected, that also could come in and buttress and help support the office of the Secretary General. So that's also kind of gone. So,
Yeah.
I think there are many things that it will take to restore this role. But again, I don't think it's impossible. It will require a mix of 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 political investment from the outside, as well as a Secretary General who really wants to play this role again as well.
You and I both have a connection to Sweden, and we should do an entire hour conversation about what happened to Swedish Foreign Ministry and its active giving up on that traditional role of playing a very critical role in multilateralism and in mediation in the past. Um, Thant had a different approach to Vietnam, though. In the missile crisis, he rather cleverly, in a subtle, very diplomatic way, managed to create space for himself and then be adopted as the trusted mediators of both sides. In Vietnam, it happened rather differently. He gave this press conference in which it sounded as if he almost lost his patience. He pointed out that there was ways of defeating communism without sending any troops in or any weapons. It had happened elsewhere in the region. And then he says something that obviously was quite sensitive to the United States. He says that the United States needs to find a face-saving exit out of Vietnam. You write that the president was livid at these comments. And I mean, this was a shocking statement and shockwaves throughout the region. At one point, Secretary of State turns to U Thant and says, "Who do you think you are? A country?" Essentially saying that the Secretary General was now going beyond his mandate as trusted stewards of the Security Council and the UN as a whole, and instead acting as a separate country. What prompted Thant to approach it this way? Was it thought through, or was it a moment of frustration and perhaps impatience that led to this, and nevertheless injected him into it, but not in the same manner, and left, of course, a tremendous amount of tensions over the course of the next few years?
I think that moment, that press conference was probably,
Mm,
or his answer that you just mentioned, it was probably a moment of frustration. But that was after a year of trying to find a way into helping solve this conflict, for which, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, he had no mandate. So the UN wasn't involved. It wasn't on the Security Council's agenda. No one was asking him formally to do anything. And he felt, I think as a Burmese as well, that he could
mm,
kind of understand what was happening in Vietnam. And he sensed, I think, better than anyone in Washington, that what the Vietnamese wanted more than anything else was to be an independent country. And whatever political system they chose or didn't chose, and he was very anti-communist at home, but in the end, that shouldn't be a problem for anybody else except the Vietnamese. And the more
mm,
people intervened from the outside, it was more likely that whatever political system they had would be that much more radical than the opposite. And he, I think, knew from history as well that the Vietnamese had no desire to be under Chinese control or Soviet control or anybody else's control. So that was something that he said to Lyndon Johnson's White House. And he said, look, if you try for a military solution, and he said this as early as 63, 64, you will lose. And there are ways in which the Americans can gracefully withdraw, that we can ensure that that region becomes neutral and non-aligned. And this will heighten, not lessen, American prestige. And he also said to the Americans, you should be on the side of revolutionary change in Asia. He didn't mean communist change, but he meant
mm.
people in Asia who wanted independence, who wanted to modernize their country. You shouldn't be afraid of this. You should embrace this. But this was completely at odds with the way in which Johnson and the people around him were thinking in 64. They assumed that if America really wanted to impose a military solution, it shouldn't have that much difficulty in a poor third world country like Vietnam. And so by the time he gave that press conference, he had actually been trying quietly, secretly, through the KGB, actually using his Soviet Kremlin contacts to broker secret talks between Hanoi, between Ho Chi Minh and Johnson's White House. And it's a complicated story you'll see in my book, or you've seen in my book, but I'm pretty sure that when the Vietnamese said yes and Ho Chi Minh sent a positive reply, a couple of people around him, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the defense secretary, and Dean Rusk, the secretary of state, never told the president until it was too late. And so the press conference was him being frustrated after this failed attempt to broker secret talks.
Mm. And his message, as you said, which he had repeated to the White House, was that this is not primarily about communism, this is about independence. That should not have been too tough of a message for the United States to digest, given the fact that the US itself actually had been a champion of decolonization to the frustration of many European countries. Why is it that at this time that message fell so flat and the United States did not take into account the repeated advice that Thant gave the US that ultimately proved to also be true?
I guess it's a mix of things. I mean, there are many counterfactuals. We can ask ourselves, would John F. Kennedy have been different? People have asked that question. He had traveled through the region. He was more sensitive to the nationalism of these newly decolonized countries, whereas Johnson hadn't, and I think had a tin ear in terms of thinking about these kinds of issues. He was much more focused on his domestic agenda. There was American domestic politics. The elections of '64 against Barry Goldwater were happening, and Johnson had no desire to look weak against communism. There were many different factors, but I think one element was also that at the end of the day, all these people in Washington, McGeorge Bundy, Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara, I think at the end of the day, they couldn't imagine that this Burmese ex-school teacher, even if he was Secretary General, could possibly know better than them in terms of what was possible, in terms of what American power could do, even halfway around the world. And so they didn't listen. I think Johnson was interested, and they had a strange relationship, these two men, my grandfather and Lyndon Johnson. They met many times. Johnson, I think, came to dislike him. I think my grandfather came to dislike Johnson in many ways, but they saw each other all the time. Johnson would make surprise visits to the UN. They would spend hours together. I see this in the transcripts of their, the meeting notes as well. And I think Johnson saw him, it was probably the foreigner that Johnson saw most often on a regular basis. And so he would often run ideas past him to try to get a sense of what a foreigner might think that he wasn't getting from the advisors around him. He also saw him in a way that no Secretary General would be today, as a potential political problem for him, grouping him together with Robert Kennedy and the Pope as three people who might cause him domestic political problems. That was how popular the UN Secretary General was in America at that time.
It's very interesting. I want to read a quick section from the book in which you quote after the US eventually did withdraw, not gracefully, from Vietnam. A New York Post editor, James Weschler, publishes a piece headlined "The Man Who Knew Too Much." And he writes that as the last scenes of collapse unfold in South Vietnam, Kissinger may prefer to forget what he and others before him were told by a wise man whose counsel they undoubtedly spurned. What compound of arrogance and ignorance led Dean Rusk, Walter Rostow, and finally Henry Kissinger, among other intellects in high places, to assume their judgment about Indochina were superior to those of the thoughtful Burmese Buddhist who served as the UN Secretary General for a decade? Was there ever any private communication from the US side to U Thant that we wish we had listened to, or you were right, or we wish we would have just pursued this in a different way? Was there ever any type of messaging along those lines from the US side after this whole ordeal?
Not really. I mean, at a tactical level, yes. I mean, there were times when the Johnson administration wanted to seem things to seem as if they were on a peace offensive. They would halt the bombing for a short period of time, and they wanted U Thant's kind of involvement in seeking some talks. This is later, I mean, in 1967, 1968. And it was maybe only towards the very end when U Thant was active again. This was in '68. And Johnson was told basically by almost everyone at that point that there was no way that he could win a war in Vietnam. And then he goes on TV and says he's not going to seek another term as president of the United States. Then he has a very different kind of conversation with U Thant. He actually comes on, again, in a surprise visit. He was already in New York. He comes and they spend a couple of hours together. And Johnson, I think, at that point really wanted to see some peace agreement before he stepped down at the end of 1968. So maybe by that point he was more sincere in wanting U Thant's help as a mediator. But in many ways, I mean, U Thant said it's too late. He recognized even by 66 that the Vietnamese had moved in a much more radical direction, was much more dependent on Soviet and Chinese aid. There were many other dynamics that were at play that would make talks, once they started, and they actually did start by 68, a much more difficult prospect in terms of success than it would have been when he first proposed them 4 or 5 years earlier.
Hmm. I think the book gives really fantastic detail of a reality that I think is largely not recognized in the United States, which is that even the most powerful country in the world will need help from friends, from small countries or from institutions to be able to make peace. I write about it, for instance, in one of my books about the critical role that Oman played in paving the way for the JCPOA. And we have a question here from Alvaro de Soto, former UN envoy himself. And he says that in the 1980s, the UN played a largely unsung role in the unwinding of the Cold War with Pérez de Cuéllar without knowing what U Thant had done, using the technique of identical letters or non-papers to key leaders. For instance, the 1982 South Atlantic crisis and later in Central America. And then he fast forwards to today and asks you, could Guterres or his successor have, or in this case, would Guterres have played such a role at the start of the Ukraine war, in your view?
Yeah, I don't know how successful that could have been, and I agree very much with Alvaro de Soto that there was this period in the late 1980s, early 1990s when Pérez de Cuéllar and his mediators, like Alvaro, were extremely active, chipping away at these problems. I mean, not just hoping for a quick win, but spending years in quiet diplomacy, shuttle diplomacy, and slowly kind of unraveling these conflicts. And it really set the stage for the consolidation of the kind of post-Cold War peace that we've enjoyed. Well, most people have enjoyed for a long time now. I think in Ukraine, on the eve of Ukraine, if it had been the UN of earlier times, I mean, again, these parallels are sometimes too general and difficult to make. But I think, you could have seen a Secretary General really rushing back and forth. I mean, to Moscow, to Kyiv, to Washington, to Beijing, to elsewhere. And maybe it wouldn't have made any difference. Maybe the Russians would have invaded Ukraine. But I think seeing the Secretary General active like that in a way would perhaps set him or herself up much better for whatever peace process or whatever mediation, whatever secret mediation could have followed. I think the worst thing is to have a war unfold and people not see the Secretary General, who is in a way, the face of the UN, not being active on the peace front. I think that then makes it impossible for him or her in the future to play a role in any other conflict in a constructive way.
And one of the things that your book shows is that at the end of the day, U Thant, being very diplomatic, very cognizant of the need he had to make sure that he didn't completely create tensions with the superpowers, but nevertheless taking advantage of the room he had to make himself indispensable, make him unavoidable, and forcing himself to be a factor in these things. And I think I wonder your thoughts on that, because we have a question from Corey Charles, who sends his regards, but I also say wants to take it to the question of what characteristics should we be looking for in the next Secretary General? The elections will be next year, if I'm not mistaken. It will be someone from Latin America. And there's plenty of discussions of, who the person should be. There's a couple of names out there, but if you take it from the standpoint of saying that there is a desire and an acceptance from the great powers that we need a stronger Secretary General, then based on your experience, both in the UN as well as having written this book and going over our dispensers, what are the key three things you think that Secretary General needs to have?
I mean, I think there's so many things that a Secretary General could be in terms of a great manager, a great communicator, and all this. But there is no Superman or Superwoman out there who are all these things. I think the person has to be someone who can be a skillful mediator. It has to be someone who understands the historical moment and knows how to mobilize the political forces that he or she will need to push through an issue, to act without a mandate, to have the support that's necessary, and the right temperament. I think it has to be someone maybe I would maybe saying not with no ego is too strong a word, but someone who's going to be quite thick-skinned,
Mm,
and is going to be cool-headed as well. I think the temperament, the characteristics of the person, the personality is not unimportant as well. But maybe we should take it from the other direction, because it is a different world. It is a different time. The challenges are different. The media, the social media landscape is very different as well. I think we should think of the actual wars that we have. I mean, what actually needs to be done? Think of the wars that we have, whether it's Ukraine,
mm,
Russia, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's a possible sudden and unexpected escalation in the Western Pacific, whatever it is, but also Sudan, internal wars as well. And what could happen in the next, say, 4 or 5 years in terms of a nuclear confrontation? And what could then be the role of a secretary general in de-escalating? And then think, what is the kind of person who could play that role? So I think rather than starting in the abstract with the
mm,
kind of person we need, where should that person be from? I think it's more, what actually needs to be done, and what is the UN's comparative advantage compared to a regional organization, compared to, an individual country. You'd mentioned Oman, other countries that might play roles in different conflicts. And then what is that specific office of the Secretary General that we need for the rest of this decade and beyond? I think that would be a useful exercise to have over these coming
mm,
months.
mm. You write also um, that at the end of the day, one can be very critical of the track record of the UN. One can point to a lot of challenges. There was a lot of tensions during the Cold War. There were episodes that were not as successful. But a wider perspective, you make a very strong pitch, I think, for realizing how much actually was achieved. And I think it's an important parallel to today with, a lack of faith and confidence that I think a lot of people have today, comparing it to that situation back then to see that a lot was achieved despite very poor preconditions as well. You're right. The planet had transitioned remarkably peacefully from centuries of dominion by a handful of European empires, and nuclear war had been avoided, and an era of superpower detente made possible. With the United States as a steel frame, all humans now belong to a single international system, which, despite its flaws and limitations, was dedicated to peace and development. This was not inevitable, and its proper realization may be yet to come. What are the key lessons here for today, given the fact that we are faced with not just a weakening of the UN, but a scenario in which superpowers are increasingly dismissive, perhaps some would say even a frontal assault on the multilateral system as a whole. You have lines of thinking already 20 years ago here in the United States on the eve of the invasion of Iraq. Richard Pearl wrote an op-ed saying, good riddance of the UNs, and hope that the Iraq war actually would get rid of the Security Council as a whole and that peace would be upheld by a coalition of the willing. Given the different circumstances we have today, what hope do you have and what lessons do you think we can be learning from what U Thant managed to do despite very, very difficult crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think he, at the end of his term at the end of 1971, he had gone through also very difficult challenges, Biafra, Bangladesh war, as well as what was happening in the Middle East at the time. But he said in an interview, when I was 20, 30 years old, half in the 1920s, 1930s, we would never have assumed or thought or imagined that Burma would become independent so soon and have an equal place at the table with the British, the French, and the Americans. We'd be
Mm,
in this beautiful building in New York, setting off peacekeeping operations, talking about outer space exploration. And if we can achieve that in 25 years, I mean, imagine what we can do if we actually have the political will to do that. So, I mean, there was an optimism in the middle of a crisis-ridden time then as well. I think one thing to think about is that, I think we should have respect for the founders of the UN. And these were people back in the late 40s and early 50s, Americans as well as others, who in their adult lifetimes had lived through two world wars that had seen 80 million plus people die, with a Great Depression in between, and realized that something else had to be possible. And were committed to that. And it wasn't just this abstract idea that something else could be possible. They set the architecture and it worked for a while. It worked in the 50s and 60s in many ways that were unexpected, in part through this office of the Secretary General. And maybe lastly, I mean, I would say that I think, in answer to your question, I think at a time of crisis, because 61 was also a crisis, right? There was the crisis in Berlin, there was the huge mess in the Congo. Dag Hammarskjöld had just been killed, the UN was bankrupt, the Soviets and the Americans looked like they were, even then, on the eve of some kind of big confrontation. That solutions sometimes come from unexpected quarters. That it wasn't Moscow and Washington, or certainly not Moscow and Washington alone, that were coming up with the answers. And it wasn't London or Paris. These ideas for solving the Cuban Missile Crisis, but these ideas for how to build this new international system were coming from people and countries all over the world. So I think we have to also, tell that story, because otherwise, if we tell the story just about the superpowers, just about the Cold War, then we're sort of trapped in not thinking that there's any alternative to that kind of traditional balance of power politics.
No, it's a great point that you make at the end of the book of how we have essentially forgotten, willfully forgotten a lot of these lessons. And you mentioned these diplomats who came through that era and experienced those wars, and that some solutions could come from unexpected sides. So we have a question from Montserrat Gurina Isern, who writes, would a group like the elders be suitable to play this role in this crisis, mindful of the fact that, I mean, this is a group of very, very experienced diplomats who have much of that experience, hopefully have not forgotten those lessons. But also in the sense, not to sidestep the UN, but do we need to complement it perhaps with some of these institutions?
Yeah, I think absolutely, and I think it's wrong to think not just on the peace and mediation issues, but on every issue, whether it's climate change or development or anything else. The UN shouldn't crowd out other possibilities. And as we look forward, I think we have to have a rigorous kind of evaluation, because we have 80 years of history behind us of what is the UN as it really is, not an sort of abstract imagination. What is it good at? What is it not good at? What bits can actually be changed and improved and refurbished to work well? And what do we see after many decades that it just cannot really do, as well as coalitions, as well as individual countries, as well as civil society networks, NGOs, or others? I think whether it's the elders or others in specific conflicts, they can definitely have a big role to play. But I think that shouldn't lessen our aim or our ambition to recraft and refurbish this office of the Secretary General for when we might need that office the most, right? And I think of all the things that need to change at the UN, and again, I mentioned before Security Council reform and adding new members, I think that would be a good thing if it was possible. But politically, it's an incredibly, steep hill to climb. Whereas now we have one thing in the UN which is definitely going to change, which is we're going to have a new Secretary General in 12, 18 months. Someone's going to be chosen. So let's focus on that. And then let's focus on not just the person it should be, but also the kind of top team of analysts, advisors that person should have, and how, in a realistic way, can we mobilize the kind of political support again, maybe from a few countries, maybe from a few countries, middle powers, and others, to give some heft to that office so it can prove itself useful to the big powers. And then they might, like during the Cuban Missile Crisis, decide that it's worth using to pull ourselves, back from a nuclear brink.
Do you think that in this new world that is moving towards, at least away from unipolarity and towards some variation of multipolarity, that the global majority or the global South can play the role that the Afro-Asian bloc played in the 1960s for U Thant? And I say this particularly mindful, I mean, this last passage you have in the book, I do want to read it because I think it's so good. You say there's been a willful amnesia. We live in a world created over the past half century by a perspective that prioritizes military alliances and the globalization of Western anchored markets and derides the proponents of peace as idealistic and hopelessly naive. The triumph of this world required the forgetting of an internationalism born in the transition from empire. And it seems to me that today, the real carriers of that tradition, those who are speaking of international law, of the UN Charter, of IHL, is increasingly states, not in Europe, but states in the global South or the global majority.
I think it has to be everywhere in a
Mm.
way. And I think one big difference between then and now is that then in the 50s and 60s, you had this generation of very charismatic, popular leaders from these newly decolonized countries who really saw themselves as actors on the international stage and who really wanted to make a mark in terms of creating a different world order. Maybe there's some aspects of that now, but I think it's a very different set of dynamics between these countries. There's a lot of water under the bridge as well in terms of conflicts between these countries and everything else. So I hope that there will be leadership from the global south, not just from governments, but from civil society as well. But I think it's equally important that, that leadership come from within the US, from Europe, from elsewhere, from all around the world. So I don't think we should focus on any particular region or aspect of the world from which we need this kind of new commitment. And I think that, in terms of forgetting the past, it's not as if there was this idealistic, abstract idea and we're still trying to scramble and resurrect it. It actually began to happen, and it actually showed success, not just in Cuba, but there were a dozen other mediated efforts. So this machine that was set up by the Americans, that the global South countries, as we would call them now, again embraced and helped to make work, that was a living reality. And so
Yeah.
it's happened. It's not as if we're imagining something in science fiction and trying to get people to think about it. So I think it's important to tell these stories because I think it's important for people to be able to see what realistic alternatives there could be to the direction that we all seem to be heading in these days.
Well, with that note, Mitch, I really do want to thank you for having written that book and told this story, because I agree with you fully. This is a story that is so needed. We are operating in a space in which people think that we're in a completely new scenario in which there are no answers and there's no examples from the past that can guide us, that can inspire us, that can point to a direction. Whereas in reality, it's not even, we're not talking about ancient history. We're just talking about a few decades away. There are people still alive today who were there, active in those moments. But as you pointed out, it is willful amnesia, and we need willful recollection of it. And in that sense, I think this is a wonderful contribution, a wonderful book that definitely left me with that very strong message that there is a pathway, the answers are there, we just have to rediscover them. Before I let everyone go, I do want to take the opportunity to also mention our next event, which will be in person on October 8th at 5:30 p.m. here in Washington, D.C. It will be a conversation with Seth Harp on his new book, The Fort Bragg Cartel. In this shocking new book that I'm sure you all have heard of, it's made a tremendous amount of shockwaves. Investigative journalist Seth Harp uncovers stunning revelations about the Special Operations Forces at Fort Bragg. He details how America's increasing reliance on largely unaccountable elite forces during our decades-long global war on terror has given rise to a web of narcotic smuggling, unsolved murders, and corruption. You do not want to miss this. So please make sure that you attend that as well. And to do so, you need to go to our website and sign up for our newsletter at www.quincyinst.org. That way, you will always receive invitations to all of those different events. So with that, again, thank you so much, Myint U, for an absolutely fabulous discussion and conversation, as well as an equally fabulous book that I strongly recommend everyone to buy.
Great. Thank you very much, Trita.
Thank you.